Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 23. As has become our practice, we begin this lesson by reviewing the personal endings for the verb and then the master verb chart. The subject and number of the verb in Greek is determined by the personal ending. This is very different from English. There are two sets of personal endings: the primary personal endings, which are used on non-augmented tenses such as the present and future, and the secondary personal endings, which are used on the augmented tenses such as the imperfect and aorist. Each set is divided into two subsets: active endings and middle passive endings. The active endings of the primary are nothing sigma iota, men, te, nsi. The middle passive endings of the primary are mai, psi, tai, methus, the, ntai. Keeping these memorized is important for quick identification of Greek verbs. The secondaries are nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, nu, with san as an occasional alternative. The secondary middle passive endings are main, sa, ta, methus, the, and nta. In white, you see the combination of the personal ending plus the connecting vowel. So far we've learned the following tenses of the indicative: the present active and middle passive, the imperfect active and middle passive, the future active, the liquid future active, the future middle, liquid future middle, the second aorist active, and the second aorist middle. As we've been trying to illustrate throughout this course, Greek verbs consist of a combination of parts that go together in unique combinations to create the various tenses. Most recently, we have been taking up the aorist tense. In our last lesson, we took up the second aorist active, the aorist that's formed like the imperfect, but uses the aorist active stem instead of the present stem. So the aorist active and aorist middle are formed with an augment, the aorist active stem, omicron or epsilon as the connecting vowel, and then one of the secondary endings, depending on whether they are active or middle. Remember that most aorist middles are deponent. In this lesson, we will take up the first aorist active, which has a tense formative. More about that in a moment. We'll follow the discussion of the form of the first aorist active by looking at slight alternatives, which occur when the stem ends in a stop. When first aorist endings show up on second aorist stems, oh my. We'll also look at aorist actives and first aorist middles, with some examples along the way. The first aorist active. A verb will either have a first aorist or a second aorist, with only a couple of exceptions. So for now, we just deal with that reality. If a verb has a first aorist, that first aorist is formed with an augment, the aorist active stem, and what distinguishes first aorist from second aorist is the aorist active stem is quite identical or parallel to the present active stem, whereas in the second aorist, the aorist active stem can look somewhat different from the present stem. Actually, it's the other way around. The present stem is looking differently from the aorist stem. First aorists, though, are most identified by the use of a tense formative, sigma alpha. And since that formative ends with the vowel, no connecting vowel is necessary, and the secondary endings are added directly. So the first aorist active is formed with the augment, aorist active stem, the tense formative, sigma alpha, that's what you should look for, and the secondary active endings. In this chart, you see the forms of the verb leo in the first aorist. The middle column shows the augment, the aorist active stem, the tense formative, and the secondary active endings. Two things of note. In the first person singular of the first aorist, the ending new drops off. This actually is quite good because then the first person singular can be distinguished from the third person plural. Secondly, in the third person singular, since there is no ending, and to avoid confusion with the first person singular, the third singular uses an epsilon instead of an alpha on the tense formative, then no ending but sometimes a movable nu. So the forms are Elisa, Elisas, Elise or Elisen, Elisamen, Elisate, and Elisan. They would be translated: I destroyed, you singular destroyed, she, he, or it destroyed, we destroyed, you plural destroyed, they destroyed. Like in the future, so in the first aorist, contract verbs form the first aorist form by lengthening the contract vowel before the addition of the tense formative. So agapao in the first aorist becomes agapesa. Poieo in the first aorist becomes epoiesa. Pleroo in the first aorist becomes pleirosa. On occasion, aorist stems that are first aorist end in a stop. In that case, we must review how a sigma and a stop interact. This chart shows examples of labials, where a p, beta, or phi combine with a sigma to form a psi. And so, for example, the stem blep plus the sigma alpha becomes eblepsa. Trib plus sigma alpha, etripsa. Graph plus sigma alpha, egropsa. The velars combine with sigma to form a xi. So, for example, plek plus sigma alpha, eplexa. Pnig plus sigma alpha, epixna. Brek plus sigma alpha, ebrexa. And with the deltas, the delta disappears. So, for example, spewed plus sigma alpha becomes epusa, and paith plus sigma alpha becomes epesa. And of course, to keep you on your toes, once in a while, these first aorist endings show up on second aorist stems. These are the cases in which that occurs. 95 times, the third person plural apon becomes apon in the New Testament. That's actually helpful because it distinguishes the form from apon in the first person singular. This also occurs on occasion with aelthon, adon, and anenkon, but the frequencies are much smaller. Possibly what's going on here is a move toward or a confusion with the alternate third person plural secondary active ending of san. The alpha nu showing up here. Could also be a little bit of confusion with the first aorist third person plural. Again, remember, Koine Greek was everyone's second language. Minor confusions like this or overlaps do occur. Let's try translating some examples. Elisamen. Notice the sigma alpha and the augment. We're dealing with the first aorist. We destroyed. Apon. The stem is second aorist, but the ending is first aorist. This is one of those exceptions. they said. Eblepsite is an example of a stem plus sigma alpha forming a first aorist. You plural saw. Egropsos is a first aorist formed on a labial. You singular wrote. Elison is a third person plural first aorist. They destroyed. Epese is an example of a first aorist with a dental. She persuaded. Epnixamen is a first aorist with a velar. We drowned. One can almost hear that in the enunciation. The liquid aorist active. The liquid aorist active is formed like the first aorist active, except the tense formative lacks a sigma. By liquids we mean stems that end in one of the following four consonants: mu, nu, lambda, or rho. So, for example, meno has a liquid first aorist. The stem main ends in a nu. The tense formative alpha is added along with the secondary active endings. As in the first aorist, so in the liquid aorist, the first person singular lacks a nu, thus distinguishing it from the third person plural. And in the third person singular, instead of an alpha, an epsilon is used. Again, this provides for a distinction between the third singular and the first singular. Meno, in the first aorist, means I remained, a favorite word of the Gospel of John and the Johannine letters. The forms of the first aorist middle. First aorist middle forms, almost all of which are deponent, are formed like the first aorist active forms, except they use the secondary middle passive endings. So again, augment, aorist active stem, sigma alpha, but a secondary middle passive ending. This chart shows the middle forms of Leo in the first aorist. The middle column displays each of the parts clearly: augment, stem, tense formative, secondary middle passive ending. And the right column shows the final forms: elisamein, eliso. This one is unusual because the sigma of the personal ending sa drops out. Alpha and omicron, by rule, contract to omega. The third singular is elisata. The first plural is elisamatha. Elisaste is the second person plural, and elisanta is the third person plural. Again, some examples will help cement our understanding of these two forms, the liquid aorist actives and the first aorist middles. Erne samatha is a deponent verb in the first aorist and would be translated we denied. Amenate is a liquid first aorist, you plural remained. Emenate is the imperfect form of the same verb, you plural were remaining. Notice the stem is a present stem, not an aorist stem, and the connecting vowel is an alpha, or is an epsilon, not the alpha of the tense formative. Erxo. This is a aorist, middle, deponent, second person singular from archomai. The alpha lengthened to an eta. The chi combines with the sigma alpha tense formative to form the xi. The sigma alpha tense formative combines with the sigma omicron second person singular form to contract to omega. You singular began. Yep, that's a hard one. Adoxata would be a first aorist middle in the pure form. He glorified himself. Aaron is a third person singular first aorist liquid active. She took up or she took away. Ekrinos is also a first aorist liquid active, you singular judged. Ekrines is the second person singular of the imperfect of the same verb. Notice, again, the difference is an epsilon connecting vowel as opposed to an alpha tense formative. In this lesson, we've looked at first aorists and their related forms. First aorist active and first aorist middle are identified most clearly by the presence of a sigma alpha. The related liquid aorist actives use just an alpha instead of a sigma alpha following the liquid consonant with which the stem ends. Some stems end in stops, and so when combined with the sigma alpha may produce a xi or a psi or just a sigma. And on rare occasions, in some third-person plural instances, certain common second aorist verbs do take on first aorist endings, which actually helps distinguish those forms from the first-person singular. I hope you do well with this lesson.